based on historical change dynamics in peaceful societies, we're not talking about wars, it takes about 1% or less of the people seriously engaged and geographically distributed throughout the ridings, or in our case, the districts, reflecting existing or quickly shaped majority public opinion to change the other 1%, the Wall Street 1%. Sometimes it takes considerably less than that, depending on who you have in the parliament. But it is an expression of widespread powerlessness that also exaggerates the formidable nature of the opposition. So when you're powerless, the opposition looks like a credible mountain. But the more power you organize at the community base, the less formidable it becomes. And this is a very important point, because progressives, or whatever you want to call them, are infinitely capable of rationalizing their own futility on that basis. I don't want to minimize the opposition. I don't want to minimize how it adjusts to being defeated on the second round and third round. But I want to point out that when you come to this realization, and we can talk about all the things in your history and our history, you become subjected to a much higher level of morale. And you become possessed of thinking you can actually accomplish it with your fellow citizens. And so you move. You don't rationalize futility. You don't say whatever will be, will be. You don't say you can't take on City Hall. You move because it doesn't seem to be so insuperable. And it's very important to keep hammering that with your friends. And when they challenge you, just give them history. How many people did it take to get Canadian Medicare established? First in Saskatchewan and then nationwide. That question is almost never asked. How many people, other than the parliaments? If Tommy Douglas wasn't born from his parents, would it have happened? How many more came to the support of Tommy Douglas? In different levels. Some worked their heads off with him. Some spent a few hours a month with him. And some just let themselves be known to pollsters that they were on his side. I know when I asked myself all the battles we've been in, we never came close to 1% seriously engaged. Defined as 200 to 300 hours a year, informed, connected with one another through districts and ridings throughout the country, and raising enough money to have a full-time office with 2 to 3, 4 advocates to spearhead the process, because the backup 1%, they go to work, they have other things, they can't do it full-time, so they support people in every district or riding full-time, and then they have some full-time advocates at the Parliament, all around the Parliament. So here in Canada, for example, look at what has been accomplished just from Duff Conacher. How many of you have heard of Duff Conacher? You know, go to Democracy Watch and you'll see what he's done. He spent a year with us in Washington, and he learned the fundamentals of the prerequisites of democracy and specific modes. And he just has been a one-man watchdog, advocate, draftsperson, getting things through Parliament and government accountability, ethics. He's not responsible for implementing them. That's another job. That's the job of the executive and so forth. But he took it to that level, and he did a lot of work on banks and preventing bank mergers and preventing the kind of things from happening that brought down our banking industry on the backs of 8 million unemployed workers and trillions of dollars of lost pension and mutual fund money and the whole taxpayer bailout of Wall Street in 2008 2009. So where the conventional treatment of inequality is, you start with the data, right? Like 50% of the Canadians now make less than Canadians made in the late 70s, inflation adjusted. Or in the United States, it's about 80%. And you go into unemployment, underemployment, you go into shrinkages or destruction of pensions, you go into concentration ratios. The top 1% of wealth in the US, wealthy people, have equivalent wealth to the combined wealth of the bottom 95%. Just think of that, 95%. And you go through all these, and we're supposed to become enraged. And then you reify them, you personalize it. You say, I remember being in South Carolina, and I went into Beaufort County, and there were kids with rickets. They were so hungry and so nutritionally deprived. And all over the country, every week in the United States, 800 people die because they can't afford health insurance to get diagnosed or treated in time. And according to the Occupational Safety and Health Agency, which we got through Congress in 1970, there are 60,000 workplace-related deaths and injuries from trauma and disease every year. That's over 1,000 a week. And there are 100,000 people who die from hospital malpractice, according to the Harvard School of Public Health. And 65,000 Americans die every year from air pollution, just from half of it from coal burning, and that's the EPA, Environmental Protection Agency. And you go through all these, and people just glaze, right? It doesn't mean anything. And then when you put proper names on them and put a human face on them, they become a little bit more interesting. It's like that little boy, that Syrian boy that was washed up on the ocean, on the shore in Turkey, I guess, and we've all seen corpses of little kids piled up all over the world, adults battling each other and killing their own kids and being killed by empire wielders like Washington, D.C., and presidents and so forth. It didn't register like that little boy. Even caught Stephen Harper's attention for other reasons, because it embarrassed his government in terms of refugee entry from areas of chaos. I'm going to go the other way. I'm going to say that it's the natural tendency of human populations not to kill each other. It's a natural tendency to be fairly accommodating neighbors, to grow enough food, build enough shelter, produce enough clothing, provide enough transportation, provide enough health care, income security, and so on. And that really is a majority viewpoint when you really come down to it. Against that is the anthropological findings that every culture, every society ever studied in the world has its 1%. Isn't that interesting? It is cross-cultural, cross-religious, cross-ethnic. You go anywhere in the world, and 1% of the people have most of the power. And so when there's a total dictatorship, a complete totalitarian dictatorship, that dictatorship has even less than 1% business people, oligarchs, and so on, military around them. So it's not a unique phenomena. It's something all human populations have to struggle against. It is not idiosyncratic to any race, color, creed, or geography. And that means it's important to go to origins. And while it may appear intellectually soft to go to these origins, I submit that's where the problems of inequality begin. They begin by permissive acceptance of growing inequality by those who are victimized. That's where it grows. Otherwise, the perpetrators couldn't get to first base. And the incentives are quite different. The incentives for the perpetrators are a lust for power and a lust for material greed. And those are very powerful motivators, let's face it. They are powerful for several reasons. One is they are very personal to the acquisitor, let's call it the person, inquisitor. And second is that they produce fear by the acquisitor, which propels the acquisitor to pile up more money. It could be fear or envy. That is often the genesis of local and national dictatorships. The more power they take, the more they fear from the people who hate them. And so they take more power, and they take more power. And it's a protective mechanism. We often don't give dictators that level of indulgence, do we? But they're afraid too. And they don't know where we're going to sleep at night, some of them, as they have different abodes and circle around with their security teams. So when those motives, and they're very simple, they're very visceral, greed, power, when they collide against civic values, there's a different texture to the motivation. Civic values are more communal, they're more cranial, they're more tolerant, up against the tight organization of plutocracies and oligarchies. They're no match unless they are organized. And unfortunately, most civic values are sort of public opinion. You know, people will say, yeah, you know, they like peace, they like living wage, they like health insurance coverage, they like child care, they like affordable education, and so on. Those are civic values. But are they organized the way the values of greed and power are organized? And the answer is very rarely. But when it does happen, and it often comes in from what is called people who call themselves liberals, progressives, conservatives, doesn't matter. Once you get to that level, they want the same things. The divide and rule tactics that polarize societies are controlling processes by a few over the many. Like in Washington, you never end up hearing every hour of the day that we live in a red state country and a blue state country. Yeah, the red states, you know, are Mississippi, Arkansas, Texas, Oklahoma. Blue states are Massachusetts, New York, California, Oregon, Washington State, and so on. And so people swallow it. They believe it. Why? Because it has a core of truth to it. They are divided on things like reproductive rights. They're divided on things like, you know, the Confederate flag being flown. They're divided on a misconceived sense of overregulation in many areas. You remember, I don't know whether it floated over the border, but when the Tea Party was organized and they said, we hate big government, we want to get rid of big government, and one of the criers said, but don't touch our Medicare. Well, it's true. Well, of course, that supersedes ideology, right? When you're sick, you want Medicare. You want health care. So here's where it starts. It starts in our schools where children are taught to believe and not to think. They're taught to memorize. They're taught to absorb what they memorize, so they vegetate. They're taught not to challenge. They're taught to accept. That's where it all starts. They are taught computer programming. They are not taught civic skills. When they're taught civics, it's rote memorization on how the government's supposed to operate. The ministries, the election, first past the post, and you know, all that stuff. It's just the way it's supposed to go. Historically, they are not taught about the great dissenters, at least the great dissenters, the great change forces. People are minimized. They're taught about politicians who win great elections. They're taught about generals and admirals. They're taught about people basically who use force, like to open up the West. One time I was 10 years old, and I came home, And I excitedly told my father, maybe I was a little younger than that I've just learned who discovered America. And he said, who? I said, Columbus. And he said, Columbus didn't discover America. He invaded America. And there were people there that he and his cohorts slaughtered in the Caribbean. And yet, look they still study Columbus as the discoverer of America and have Columbus Day, which is a holiday. So here's what happens in our educational process. We graduate, we don't have a clue on how to be a practicing citizen, which is one reason half the people in the States don't even bother voting. Because they say, what should I vote for? It doesn't mean anything to me. They're going to do whatever they want. They're all crooks, or, I'm too busy, I'm working, I'm commuting. You know all the reasons. It's not that much better here in Canada. And so what they do is they reduce their own significance as citizens down to almost absolute zero. They basically accept what is given them, and they are very vulnerable to a twisted definition of freedom. And you say to people in the United States, you live in a free country? They're darn right. Now you get rid of some big government, we'll be even freer. And you say, well, what do you mean by being free? There's no distinction between personal freedom and civic freedom. Yeah, even in dictatorships, there's a lot of personal freedom. And in Canada and the US, there's personal freedom. You can pick your friends. You can eat whatever you want. You can download whatever music you want. You can travel here and there. You can choose your clothing. You can decide what books you want to read. You can choose your university within limits. You can pick what kind of work you want to do in life. You can decide when to cut the grass, shovel the sidewalk. You can decide when you want to grumble and have to go out of your front door because you got to go down to some box to collect a letter because the postal union rolled the Canadian people and showed me that they were more apathetic than I ever dreamed of, that they allow something like that, which is going to lead to a lot of falls and hip breaks and discomfort for what? So anyway, you're free to do all these things. You're free to even tell the prime minister off. That's not civic freedom.